Thanks for coming to the presentation. It's just after lunch. Hopefully I can keep everyone awake here. This is first time I've written and done this presentation, so it's going to be fun. We'll see if I have enough time to get through it or if I move too fast or whatever. I'd like your feedback after if you could do that, so that'd be fantastic. This presentation is basically going to be me going over 5 examples of dial plan and just going through what I built and how it was built and just maybe trying to go through some of kind of a best practices and showing what dial plan looks like. This is all based on Asterisk 1.8, and 4 of these recipes are in the Asterisk cookbook, which is freely available online. So yeah, we'll get started here. So I'm Leif Madsen, an Asterisk consultant and co-author of various Asterisk books, along with Jared Smith, Jim Van Megelen, and Russell Bryant. I'm the Asterisk bug marshal and release manager with Digium. So when a bug is filed, I triage issues and make sure all the information is there. And the release manager's process is basically taking the Asterisk source code from Subversion and turning it into a tarball and getting that released. So yeah. So overview, I'm going to try to use the problem solution discussion methodology from the cookbook. So I'm going to kind of pop up a screen that's going to say what the problem is that's going to be solved, and then show the solution to the problem, and then obviously I will discuss the solution that's being shown. If there's any questions during that, I will try to see you and point it out, and you can ask a question. And kind of want this to be a little bit of a back and forth, I think, because with Asterisk dial plan, there's always like 100 different ways to do the same thing. What I'm showing seems to be best practices that seems to work well and makes the dial plan fairly readable. As readable as you can make the dial plan. There are a lot of brackets and braces, and especially when you start nesting functions and variables and stuff within it. So I'll try to point out why I'm picking that particular solution. So the problems that I'm going to be solving start very simple and basically increase in complexity as we go, where the last one is a little bit crazy, but I thought it was a really neat way of showing some of the flexibility and creativity of the dial plan. So if you can be really creative or crazy when you're writing your dial plan, and while there may be solutions that you would maybe go, why would you do it that way? Why wouldn't you just use an AGI? Or why wouldn't you just have something that you trigger and have the AMI actually do everything? I just really like trying to do everything in dial plan. I find it a bit of like a challenge to try and do that. So I like taking problems that people provide me and trying to do them all in dial plan. So that's kind of, I find that a really good example of craziness. So the first one, very simple. We just want to create a loop in the dial plan. So we have a context at the top here, which is what's in square braces, and I've called the context the iterating loop. On the first line, I pretty much always start with the verbose application because in dial plan, when you create an extension, you always have to start with this extend equals greater than. Then you have either a pattern match or the extension name. In this case, I'm just calling it the word start. It could be anything. It could be loop. It could be begin, whatever you wish. And you have to have the priority number of 1 there. And then you have some sort of an application. This could be a no-op. I like using verbose because it gives you some output on the dial plan, on the console for Asterisk and things like that. Then you'll see this syntax on the left that says same equals greater than. Basically all that means is that whatever the extension name was, in this case start, was called, I'm just continuing to use that. So instead of having to define extend equals greater than start every single time, we can use the word same to indicate that. Really handy when you have a very complex pattern match. Having to write that or copy it manually every single time for every line you're writing is incredibly frustrating and very error prone. So the first line here, we have a set. We're just creating a counting variable and just initializing it to the number 1. The next line is just the verbose telling me that I'm starting the loop. Next application there is the while application. And what this is going to do is you're going to define, so what we're doing here is less than or equal to 5 times. And the beginning and the end are defined by the while, so that's the top of the loop. And the bottom of the loop is here, if I can get my mouse, is here where it says end while. So these 2 lines are going to be implemented or iterated through the loop for this number of times between the while and the end while application. So we just have a verbose, prints out the current value of x is, and then this is how you show the variable or the value of x. We use the set application here. We set the variable x to the value. So this is the inc function. There are other ways that are usually shown where you have like a dollar square brace and then dollar curly brace x curly brace plus 1 square brace at the end. That's kind of the more traditional way to do it. The inc and its sister dec, which is decrement, functions are fairly new. I think they're either new in 1.6.2 or in possibly 1.8. And all that's doing is you pass it the name of the variable, and it takes whatever the value is and passes it out. It doesn't actually modify the value. So you could use this if you just need to say, oh, what's the next number going to be, and whatever the case may be, you could use it within other parts of the dial plan. And it's just taking the value that x plus 1 is and assigning it back into the x variable. And then that'll increment through 5 times and continue on. It'll say verbose, end of loop, and then it'll just hang up the call. So the next one is controlling call limits. This is done using the group and group count functions. So again, we have our context at the top. We start with the extend line, which defines our pattern match. In this case, it's a North American style pattern match. I have broken my own rule here, and on the first line used a set. So I probably shouldn't have done that, but it shows it's not wrong. It's just if I want to change that line or if I want to put something in front of that set, it's not really a big deal. All I have to do is go and hit enter under, hit enter on the set, create a new line, and then type, tab same equals greater than n, and then just leave that line there and replace it with a no op or a verbose. So the first line there is a set, which is using the group function, and I've created like a category called outbound, so I could have the inverse of that, say inbound, for example. And I've just used equals my provider. So if I had multiple providers and I wanted to track the number of outbound calls being used on that provider, then I could just do that and have different provider names, for example. The next line is the set, and the value or the variable count is being set to the value of whatever the number of channels are that have had the group set on it. So what the good thing with this is that there's no database, it's not left externally, there's no cleanup at the end. When the channel's destroyed, that number is incremented and decremented as appropriate. So that's why this is really good for counting the number of channels within, within some sort of logical context or something that you want to define. Where it says outbound here on the first line is actually it's unnecessary. You don't have to do it. It's just a category if you want to define kind of groups of things where you could have my provider. And like I said, outbound and inbound is probably a pretty good example. Syntax is just whatever you want to count. So my provider at, and then the category. So in this case, it's going to print out using the no-op, which is similar to verbose, except no-op doesn't print out unless you have like set verbose at least 3, so where you're seeing the dial plan iterate through. If you have verbose and you're using verbose with, if I go back here, you see verbose, and it has 2, comma, and then the line, which is basically what's being put out onto the console. If you have set verbose 1, or in this case 2, you can just see what you've output customized without having to see all the dial plan. In this case, this is more of a debugging way where only if you were going to be looking at the entire dial plan executing, then you're going to see that. Otherwise, when you have set verbose 1 or 2, you won't see it. So it's more of you can think of it as more of a debug versus a notice or a verbose. Then we have a go-to-if, which is just checking the value of count. And if it's greater than 2, then we'll go to the denied label. And that's defined with where you see n. If I can move my mouse. So you see n, and then it says denied here. This is a priority label. So because there's no numbers here, this number is just auto-incremented in memory. The n denied is the label. So it allows me to just say denied or continue within this same extension and within the same context. So in this case, if it's greater than 2, so 3 or more, we will go to denied, where then it'll do the no op here and says there are too many calls. We're going to hang up the call, and then it just hangs up. If we were nice, we would place some sort of message that says, there's too many calls on the system, and you try your call later or whatever. If we do continue, then we go down to the continue label, and that'll execute the go subroutine, which is just calling, using the call my provider subroutine. We'll look at subroutines here in a minute, which will help explain what go sub actually is. If you've used macros, go sub are just an alternative to macro, which has a lot less memory issues and things like that. So I'll talk about that in a minute, which is right now. Any quick questions while I'm here? This would be 1. So when you do group outbound equals provider, the value here is 1. So they start at 0, but then I'm incrementing that the very first time I use it, so we start at 1. Yeah. That's a great question. I don't even know. I'll have to look that up. Yeah, I think it used to be like that. It might. I honestly don't know. Let's see here. I gotta move along here. So here we have a subroutine, which is very similar to a macro, which is essentially a block of code that we can reutilize time. So you can think of it as essentially a function within, if you're doing a program. It's a function you can call and you pass it data and it returns data. So in this case, I've defined 3 pattern matches that are going to use the same subroutine, and the subroutine goes in. You can either use, it's like a go-to, so it's similar syntax where you can have either go sub priority, which is always required, in this case 1. You can have extension and the priority, or you can define the context, the extension and the priority. In this case, I'm just using an extension and a priority. So we're using the same subroutine, which is essentially just an extension within the dial plan. There's no special syntax like we have with macros, where you have to have macro hyphen name within braces and call it that way. You can think of it almost like a go-to with memory. So it has some sort of ability to return. And it's not even necessary to return. You don't have to return from the subroutine. Like I said, it's a go-to with memory. So here we have out1, and we pass it the value of extend, which is essentially just whatever the value of this is. And I'm stripping off the plus, which is 1, whatever. So I have multiple 1s, so I'm passing it the same data each time. Again, same thing here. And this is actually an error. There should be a 1 here so that it was exactly the same. I'm just assuming that my provider doesn't care whether there's a 1 or not. Same thing here, pass 1 in the number. And I've actually done it correctly here, where I just pass the value and attach the 1 to the beginning. That's what I'm doing here. This is how you concatenate data onto a channel, onto a variable when you're passing it. You just put it there. It's just there's no pluses, there's no special concatenation arguments or characters you need. You just put it there, and it's going to pass whatever that value is. So the trick here, and it's a little ugly, is that you have the open braces here. And then you have what you're defining as the extension and the priority. And the argument is defined again within round braces. So when we go to out1, we do set, and we were using the local function, which allows me to define some sort of scope. So this value, or this dialing number variable, is only going to be used within this subroutine. And if I return, it'll just be destroyed and removed out of memory. And I'm just assigning that the value of arg1 to something that's a little easier to read. I have the output of verbose, which is saying what I'm calling. When you're calling it, when you're setting it, you have to use the local function, but when you're calling it, you don't have to. You can, it doesn't hurt anything. You could do dollar, curly brace, local, round brace, variable name, and then close it off, but it's unnecessary. Here I'm just setting a couple of caller ID values, the name and the number, and I'm setting that from some global value I've set. So in the globals context at the top, I've set, this is my own syntax. I always use a G underscore just to kind of tell me that this is a global variable that I've set, and set the CID name and number for this particular company that I'm using for the outbound dialing. So where I'm seeing it here up here, the caller ID name, this would be like the internal or whatever is set for the device, and then I'm resetting it when I place the outbound call. Doing a dial, again, global, G underscore business PSTN. That would be something, say, like SIP / my provider or my ITSP or whatever the case may be. / and the value of the dialing number, in this case, let's say 1-416-555-1212. Then I use the exec if here to, if the dial status, when I get a value back, if it happens to be busy, I'll play a busy tone for 5 seconds and then hang up. Otherwise, I just hang up. If I place a dial and the call completes and I hang up, then there's no more dial plan being executed within this subroutine. So a little more complex. Actually, maybe there's a good time for questions if there's any. Excellent. Building find me, follow me, and dial plan. So here we have the public extensions context, and I've defined a couple of extensions here, and I could actually clean this up a bit and potentially create a subroutine that does most of this stuff for me, and then I just pass it arguments and I could loop through, but we'll keep it nice and simple. So what we're doing with, overall what we're trying to do here, or the way this is implemented, is that when the call is placed in the find me, follow me, it's going to call someone, and when they answer the call, we're actually going to play back a message and let them acknowledge whether they want to answer the call or not. So that'll make more sense here in the next slide. So here we're doing a playback. Let's just tell me, please hold while I try to call them. And we have this argument no answer, which just means early media, if the channel can support it. We're using the local channel to call an extension at the trusted context. Using a value of 20 seconds, we're passing fake ring indication, which isn't usually necessary. And then this capital U means execute a subroutine on the called channel before the channels are bridged. So that's going to allow us to play audio to the channel that we're calling or the endpoint that we're calling. At the time when they answer it, Asterisk will actually play back some stuff and wait for input based on how we've created this subroutine and allow them to either acknowledge the call and then bridge them, or ignore it and return busy, and then the call's just dropped. In this case, if it's busy on the first line, it'll actually fall over to another dial application and again call that some number within the trusted context. So here's the trusted context that we're calling. And so 700101, which is where we called here on the local channel, there's the extension within the context. In this case, it's doing a dial out to some particular device. So we can define that in here, and obviously within, you could make this more elaborate where it does lookups in database to determine what that extension is, and we could use pattern matches and all sorts of things, but for clarity, it makes a little more sense to just put it in there. We have a pattern match, which allows us, so when we're calling this 1256 fake number, it can be matched on this pattern match, and we just do a SIP / the number that was pushed in, which is not being set here, and at the provider. It's actually should be extend here, not number, because I haven't actually set the value or the variable of number. I will have to make a note of that because I'll fix it on the book. So this is the ACK call. So where you see here, this is the subroutine ACK call, extension S, priority 1. Macro has the same syntax where the separator is a caret. It's just kind of an old way of doing it. It's kind of funny, but it's because within the application we used commas it could be interpreted as something else. So that's why it uses carets. Excuse me. So once I've answered the call, background application plays. It says follow me, no recording, follow me /options, and plays some audio. Again, just like an IVR or an auto attendant, we use wait extend, wait 5 seconds. If there's no response, then we set the go sub result as busy, which will essentially tell the dial application that the call was rejected. If they press 1, there's nothing, and the call, basically there's nothing else to happen within the subroutine, so now the bridging can continue, the next step of what would happen normally if there was no subroutine there. 2, again, busy. If I press 3, I get busy. So unless I hit 1, the call's going to be rejected, essentially. So this is the crazy one. How much time do I have left? What time do I go to? 1:45. Do I have 5 minutes? 10 minutes. So here's the kind of the crazy one I was talking about. Any questions up to this point? Okay, so this is an overview of essentially what I'm trying to do. I want to play audio. In this case, I'm using the Say Digits application. Is going to say 48. And that audio is going to be played onto the caller. So this is Asterisk. The square box is Asterisk. These round endpoints are essentially devices or phones that are calling between each other. So this is a channel here. So we have a device. There's a channel. Goes into Asterisk. Another channel set up, and it calls a device, and they're talking to each other. What we want to do is play audio onto the caller channel. The example and the reason why I built this was essentially I was working for a customer that was a psychic network, and when the caller is talking to the psychic, you need to be able to allow the caller to determine how long have they been on the call and how much money have they spent. And you don't want to break the call and have it update or anything like that. You just want to whisper over top of the caller so they can hear it. The agent doesn't hear anything. They just keep talking and doing whatever they do. And now the caller can hear both how much money they're spending and their future. So I'm going to try, because it gets a little kind of abstracted, and I thought if I was just showing dial plan code that there'd be glazed eyes. I spent actually quite a bit of time trying to come up with this, so this is where feedback would be great, is if this makes sense. So here we start. We set up a call. No problem. In order to be able to create the ability to hit some sort of DTMF key on the phone, I create myself an application map, a custom application map. And this is done in the features.conf file. And I've just called it play_message. I could call it anything I want. The trigger is #1. And it can be triggered by self, which just means the person who hit the DTMF, /caller, which is, in this case, the caller is essentially the left side of this graphic. And the callee, which is the other argument, would be the other channel that my channel is talking to. So if I had switched this to callee, then the agent would, or the psychic would hear the message, which is not very useful. And then what happens is this macro is used, and the macro is the play message macro that I'm going to define here in a minute. So when I hit #1, this is the macro that's being executed, and this graphic essentially shows it's going to execute some dial plan. So the macro that is being executed, again, we've defined it macro-play message. That's the way that has to be defined in order to execute a macro. Always the S extension. Again, we have the no op at the top, which means nothing. We set the value, or this variable called encoded channel, to pass. And I'm using the URI encode function to take the dynamic peer name, which could be anything. And if it had some kind of crazy values in it or anything else like that that I wanted to parse on or anything like that, that's why I'm using URI encode, which essentially kind of makes it more safe to pass. And that's just set to this channel variable. Then I use the originate application, which is essentially going to tell Asterisk to create a channel just like a call file. Kind of the same idea, except that you're triggering it instead of putting a file into a directory and letting Asterisk read it and trigger it, or from the Asterisk manager interface, which is another way of doing this. I'm using the originate application. Again, same thing, you can even do it on the CLI. There's lots of ways to create channels kind of out of nothing and try to connect them together. Using the local channel, and then I'm passing it spy hyphen, and then the encoded channel, and then the whisper channel is the context, and these values here, extend, whisper channel, audio, and 1, means that when I create the local channel, when the local channel, or in this case, it could be a SIP channel, for example, if to simplify it a bit, ignore the local channel for a second. If I was calling a SIP channel, so another SIP device, when that SIP device answered the call, I'm going to connect it to an extension within the dial plan in the context whisper channel to the extension named audio priority 1. And when that channel answered, it's going to execute whatever dial plan happens to live there. In this case, it happens to be a local channel, and we'll get a little crazy here in a second. So outside of that, I've originated a channel. An asterisk, which is the box, is essentially going to call an endpoint. So in my example here, to simplify it, it's a SIP channel. In the real thing, it'll be the local channel. And once that endpoint has answered, it's going to execute the dial plan I've told it to execute, which is the whisper channel context, audio extension, priority 1. And once, let's say that the dial plan is just doing a playback, so what it's going to do is play audio to the other end. So in this case, all your base belong to us. So knowing that, if we look at here, the local channel spy hyphen encoded channel to pass at the context name, this is how we get here. So we have underscore spy. Underscore means pattern match. Spy, literally SPY. If I was using an X, an N, or a Z in this, I would have to put it in square braces to mean literal, because X, Z, and N have special meanings. The period means one or more characters, and that's the extension. I take the value, so I'm basically splitting off from the extend, which is spy hyphen whatever. I'm taking just the second and third values because there's 2 hyphens in there. I wish I had more output here. But basically what I'm doing here is stripping off the word spy. That's what I'm doing, and assigning it to the value encoded channel. I'm using group like we explained, or what we talked about before, just to make sure I'm not playing multiple things at the same time. Let's say the user accidentally hit #1, and I originate multiple channels. I don't want to play lots of audio over top of it, so it's just to make sure there's only one per. And then the channel to spy, which is the endpoint that we've passed and set in, and I'm using chan spy, and this is the channel to spy on. So I've set it here to the value, and then I'm passing it to chan spy. There's a bunch of values here which are essentially the W is whisper to the channel, S is silent, so don't play a beep, Q is quiet, so don't play the channel type, so that you don't want lots of extra audio there. Capital E is exit after the bridge is closed, and B means barge in. So the real key there is mainly the W, because it means I'm just going to push audio onto the channel. I don't really care about getting audio back. So asterisk calls the local channel, which is executing the chan spy. The chan spy is connecting to the channel that dialed #1, and we're whispering audio to it. Once that has happened, then we now go to the audio extension, which is, in this case, is very simple. I'm just setting the volume, the transmission volume, to -4 dB because I found it was very loud when I was testing. And then just using say numbers. This is static, not dynamic. In this case, we could make it very dynamic, do a database lookup and pass the audio, but we're just playing back $7.48. So that's how we get the audio. So once the local channel executes the chan spy, we're whispering onto the channel that executed the #1. And once that has answered, we execute some dial plan, and that dial plan happens to be playing audio onto the channel that hit #1. And to actually enable the functionality for this particular channel, because we may not want it on everything, We use dynamic underscore features equals play underscore message. Play underscore message is the name we defined in features.conf. Dynamic features is just a built-in variable that will allow us to assign this to this channel, which is placing a dial. Questions? That's it.